Welcome to the 2021 On-Farm Network Results Series. I'm Megan Burns, agronomist for the On-Farm Network program. We've been conducting both single and double inoculant trials in soybeans for several years now in the On-Farm Network. Let's get into our 2021 soybean single inoculant trial results. So single inoculant trials compare soybeans with and without a single application of seed-applied inoculant. In these trials, we're interested in quantifying nodulation, yield, and we've added seed quality analysis, particularly looking at protein as well. So it's important to note that in order to qualify for this trial type, fields must have had at least 3 previous well-nodulated soybean crops in the last 10 years. So we know that the rhizobium that soybean used to form their nodules is not native to our soils. So before we look at any steps to reduce our inoculant management practices, we obviously need to have sufficient nodulation there and sufficient inoculation there for some time to allow our rhizobia populations to build up. So that's why we require this minimum 3-year soybean history in order for fields to qualify for this trial. So we had 3 of these this season, comparing soybean with and without a single inoculant, all in kind of south central Manitoba. So those are the locations that we were working with this year. And this is the nodulation rating scale that we use in the on-farm network for soybean. So we're rating the plants, looking at their above ground biomass, looking at their growth and vigor. And then obviously we're digging up the roots and looking at the number of nodules. So you'll see the rating that is associated with that number reported in our results that we'll get to in a minute. And then we also look at nodule position on the roots, whether it's more crown or lateral or a combination of the two. But for our results for today, we're going to focus on how many nodules are present. Now, before we get into results, just a couple of very general notes on nodulation in 2021. Obviously, it was dry. We know that it was really dry, and we saw some flowering on some pretty small or early V-stage soybeans that were likely pretty stressed this season. Overall, it seemed that nodulation was a little bit lower, maybe on average, than what we've seen in previous seasons under maybe less stressed conditions. And it was also slower to develop, it seemed, this season. So we'll take a look at whether or not the nodulation ratings that we got were still agronomically sufficient. Now, in order for nodulation to be agronomically sufficient, we're talking about more than 10 nodules per plant. So that puts us, somewhere between a 2 and a 3. So while we did see generally slower and lower nodulation, maybe this year as a general observation than what we've seen in past years, and in the vast majority of cases, it still falls into that agronomically sufficient category where we would expect there to be enough nodules to meet the nitrogen nutrition needs of our soybean plants. Okay, so getting into the results now, the first trial here, we had, like I said, this is lower than what we've seen in the past, but we're still falling between that fair to good scale or fair to good category on the rating scale. So this should be an agronomically sufficient level of nodulation, and we certainly saw that, it didn't seem to harm yield at all, certainly in a drought year. These are pretty decent yields, and we didn't have any significant yield difference between our inoculated and uninoculated soybeans at this site. So when we don't have a significant yield response in these single inoculant trials, you'll see a drop in profit per acre presented of about $3.50 an acre. So that's reflective of that increased input cost of the single inoculant. In the springtime, we're not seeing that return on investment at harvest if we don't have a significant yield response. So that's why that's presented that way. So our next trial actually had a bonus treatment of Eco-T. Eco-T is a biological product. It was applied on the seed here, and it's meant to just promote seedling root growth and nutrient use and reduce seedling disease pressure. So we rated it for nodules, even though it's not an inoculant product, like a rhizobium inoculant product. But nonetheless, we still took a look at it because it was in this trial layout. So again, we're seeing lower nodulation than what we've seen in past years, where we would be kind of 3.5 to 4 on the scale, but still should be agronomically sufficient. Again, we're falling in that fair to good category. No significant yield difference between any of the 3 treatments. So the single inoculant didn't make a difference for yield, and neither did Eco-T. So we have a loss in profit per acre associated with the cost of those products then. And finally, our third trial, which was in a conventional soybean variety, we saw a little bit better nodulation here, and it was agronomically sufficient, obviously. No significant difference in yield between single and uninoculated soybeans, and so we have that associated loss in profit per acre, equivalent to the cost or rough cost of that single inoculant practice then. So like I said, we are looking at quality analysis as well. We have protein analysis underway, and hopefully we'll have those results back soon. But if we take a look at our results across the network and all the single inoculant trials that we've conducted so far, we've had 36 of these so far. You'll see they're very much focused in the eastern half of the province, where we have a little bit more soybean history built up, generally speaking, compared to Western Manitoba. So that's why they're all kind of focused on that half of things. We've had 36 of these and no significant responses so far. And keeping in mind that this is where we've had at least 3 well-nodulated soybean crops in the last 10 years. So if we take a look at how those fields kind of break down in terms of their soybean history, and dive a little deeper into why we might not be seeing any cases where we have a significant response, we have really good history here, right? So we're talking about 3 to 10 plus years of previous soybean crops in these fields. So we have really good soybean history built up, and we're talking about relatively short rotations as well. So the longest we've seen in these single inoculant trials is 4 years, but 83% of these trials have soybean history of 2 years or less. So we have a lot of soybean history, and we have very recent soybean history in the fields where we've been conducting those trials, and that likely very much plays into the persistence of the rhizobium population over time, and then the lack of need for the single inoculant at these trials. So that's probably playing into why we haven't seen significant response across the 36 fields where we have conducted a single versus no inoculant trial in soybeans. So as you're making inoculant decisions, we'd encourage you to consider like your whole package of management conditions and decisions that play into successful nodulation, right? So talking about things like soil and environmental conditions, nodulation history and field history, and so on. And be cautious. So consider your package of conditions and management and weigh the risk of nodulation failure with, the relatively low cost of a single inoculant on the seed. So we're still investigating this, and really until we find a case where we have some significant response to that single inoculant compared to no inoculant, we don't know or have necessarily a good idea about what conditions will lead to that outcome. So it comes down to, needing some more single inoculant trials in more places. What we would really love to see, and what we're curious about, is what happens when we run one of these trials where we still have that, 3 years of soybean history in the last 10 years, because that's a requirement for the trial. But if we go a little bit further from our last soybean crop, so if we push to 5 years from our last soybean crop, for example, what happens then is that single inoculant, is that the kind of magic distance between soybean crops or length between soybean crops that single inoculant becomes very important for yield then and performance. So those are the types of things that we want to continue to investigate as we continue with these trials with farmers who are interested. So a big thank you to all of our on-farm network participants. If you're interested in learning more, getting involved, or if you have a trial idea, please feel free to contact us at any time. Thank you.